Coming up next on At Your Service, we'll be talking with Dr. Jeff Bostic from the Maryland Mental Health Response Team. Stay tuned. Today on At Your Service, we are talking with the Maryland Mental Health Response Team. We will be discussing how this expert team supports the school systems across the state of Maryland so we can better support students and caregivers. Well, welcome today, Dr. Bostic.
Thank you, Susan.
And so, I announced your name. Can you talk a little bit about your role and your position at MSDE?
Sure. So in 2022, the Maryland State Department of Education created a school mental health response team. And so our job is to basically enhance and support all the school districts or all the LEAs kind of across the state. So that's what we do. We're not here to replace anybody that's like working in any like town or school district or whatever, but rather just to like be supportive, to be helpful with everything they're doing to encourage and be proactive about mental health with kids. So specifically, we do like trainings and professional development kind of programs on a variety of topics, really anything related to mental health. And then anytime there's like an unusual event that happens, where schools are like, oh my goodness, if something happens, unfortunately, sometimes students or family members will die, and it'll be like, oh my gosh, how do we like respond to that? Or teachers will have difficulty or suddenly be out. So we'll respond and try to help the staff navigate that. Sometimes also, though, it is like we have a really complicated case. And indeed, Ryan's created this incredible program where it's very proactively like looking at kids who are really starting to struggle. And one of the things they do now is loop in some of us, because the team from the Maryland State Department of Education has a child psychiatrist, probably one of the few states that does that. And then also we have like behavioral specialists, we have psychologists, some of them, Kristen Finelli, a bunch of them. So we have a bunch of different kind of roles, social workers and so forth. So depending on what we can do to be helpful and contribute to like thinking about the variety of things available for people kind of across the state that might be applicable to a student in Anne Arundel is kind of what we do.
So can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure.
And how you ended up at Maryland State Department of Education?
Sure. It's a little bit of a circuitous path. The bottom line was I talk funny because I'm from Texas, okay? So I grew up there, and I went to, actually I was a school teacher in Waco, Texas, okay?
Wow.
Yeah, I taught like middle school and high school. This is like way back when dinosaurs walked the earth. But I went on from there and went to medical school. And in medical school, the best part of that for anybody that's thinking about going to medical school is you do everything. And so you kind of where you fit. And mental health was like just a really natural fit for me. And so I started doing, you do adult psychiatry, then child psychiatry. But I went up to Boston to finish up my child psychiatry training at Mass General. So then I actually stayed up there for 25 years and worked in the local schools in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire. Again, because of my school background, working in schools for a long time. And then I moved down here in 2016. And I work a lot with the National Center for School Mental Health at the University of Maryland. And I also was on faculty at Georgetown, which I did. I still do a little bit of work with them, but most of my work transitioned again a couple of years ago to the Maryland State Department of Education. So my background has always been in child psychiatry, but I've never been a hospital guy. I've always been like, let's work in schools, because kids spend 15,000 hours in schools between K and 12. So we can do way more for cultivating good mental health and everything else at school than we can try to do, an hour a week in therapy kind of stuff. So that's always where I put most of my energy.
Awesome. And you mentioned a lot of the things that the Maryland Mental Health Response Team does. I don't know if there's anything you want to elaborate. Like, what is like your typical day look like supporting school systems throughout the state? I know that we, as you mentioned, utilize you a lot for student behavioral consultations, and you're an essential part of a team that we have in terms of giving us that medical viewpoint and support when it comes to mental health diagnoses and medication, things like that. So what does a typical day of yours look like? And maybe a typical week, because it may not look the same every day. So.
Well, the big parts are like Mike Mumford is kind of the director of the program, and so he routes all of us on the team depending on what we need to do. So a typical week is probably a better example. We'll usually have something that'll go on somewhere across the state where there's some complexity about a situation where the school district is going, oh my gosh, we've had this difficult event, help us manage this, because people are personally involved. It's really difficult for us, the staff, when a student is harmed or injured, or a family member or an educator. So oftentimes we're there to just just kind of be like a helpful sounding board or voice for that. So that's not uncommon that we'll do that in a state as big and dense as Maryland. My time is largely spent with doing trainings. People are like, oh my gosh, what is this latest thing that we're hearing about? Whatever it might be, bipolar disorder versus disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. How do we figure out what we're going to do in the classroom with a kid that's been diagnosed on the outside or in a hospital based on that kind of stuff? So a goodly part of my week is spent trying to provide training to various LEAs depending on what kind of kids they're working with. And then, as you guys know, when we have complicated kind of kids, it's not that we know something that you guys don't already know, but sometimes it's helpful just to go, who's got no skin in the game? It's kind of the phrase that Ryan has used. And someone who could just stand back and kind of be objective, if you will, and not feel any pressure within their LEA to go, what about this? Have we thought about that? And as you guys both know, frequently I'm also extolling other programs around the state. A very common one is, quote, BHIP, one of the programs where anybody in the state, regardless of their insurance status, regardless of where they live in the state, can get free mental health support. They can get evaluated. They can have their pediatrician or primary care doc talk to a child psychiatrist or a psychologist who can help them. And also they keep up with who's actually alive and still practicing in whatever area of town a person might live. So we're always like trying to make sure that we're connecting the dots as far as schools with new programs that are going on that might be useful to them as well. So that's what I spend most of my week doing, is working with individual cases kind of across the state. And then when something unusual occurs, our team will kind of figure out collectively how we're going to respond to that. And then again, professional development stuff, we usually have some of that every week as well for somebody.
Excellent. And you mentioned BHIP. Can you just real quickly, if a parent wanted to access BHIP, would they just put Google search B-HIP? Is that how?
So BHIP has the best name. So this is a program that actually started in Massachusetts, and I was there and had nothing to do with the creation of it. So I don't want to take credit for stuff that I didn't do. But I was in the very first one that was created. McPap was what it was called. And the point was, it was a way that a pediatrician or a primary care clinician could reach to one person, again, who keeps up with the insurance, like that is, which providers are still around and available and are taking new patients and all that kind of stuff, because the pediatricians can't keep up with that. Right? So McPap was the one in Massachusetts. The one in DC was called DC MAP. We worked on that one too. And then BHIP, Behavioral Health in Primary Practice or something like that. That was the best name, BHIP, right? So that's the one in Maryland. But anybody, any parent can talk to their primary care clinician. And then that primary care clinician will contact BHIP directly and say, hey, I got a kid. It's like this. We're not sure what would benefit them or be helpful for them. And so sometimes they'll arrange an evaluation that's free again to do that. Sometimes that's done by tele. Or sometimes they'll say, oh, you need a therapist who's like really good at working with kids who've been through some kind of trauma, or who's struggling with obsessive compulsive disorder, or whatever it might be. And so they'll route people to, again, viable providers with that kind of stuff who'll take their insurance and whatnot.
And did I hear you correctly there? If they don't have insurance, will they still try to find them a clinician? So that's really a great resource for families, that we could send them to, or say, ask your pediatrician.
Yes, but no good deed goes unpunished. So what happens oftentimes when a kid has absolutely no insurance and they live in certain areas, it'll be like, well, there's not any real providers who take, nothing right now. But the school, given that they have, so it's oftentimes they'll include that. But see, we love that.
Right.
We've been working, actually, all the states now have a program like BHIP or McPap or DCMAP, one of these programs. Because the programs worked really fabulously for accelerating people being able to have access to mental health care.
Right.
But oftentimes it's trying to fuse that with the school, and so to make sure that all these entities are working together, because that's honestly the future. We've realized that, doing stuff in silos is silly. You don't worry about typically going to your physician and then want to keep that all off limits. People are getting better and better and better about that with mental health care. It's much more common that people will be open and talk about mental health care now than in past times. It's not stigmatizing in the same kind of way.
That's true.
Yeah, and especially because when, we still have young children, that it's so different than when we went to the doctors today. Part of their exam is asking them mental health questions.
Training them, sure.
Training them, yeah. So definitely.
Excellent. So what do you, as we talk about mental health and behavioral health. What are some of the, for the parents and community members out there, what are some of the biggest mental health challenges facing children? And I know when we say children, we're really ranging from school-age children, pre-K to 12th grade. I know it can be a variety of things, but what are some of the most common things you see?
Yeah. Well, the most common thing typically that arises for all of us, including kids, is like anxiety stuff. And of course, it's hard to see because it's kind of in your mind. It's easy to see attention deficit disorder. Oftentimes, kids are like running around and fidgeting and stuff like that. But anxiety stuff, not so easy, and kids can be pensive. And it's difficult because young kids, particularly when they're 5, 7, 9, 13 even, they're not going to look up and go, you know, Mom, I'm feeling very distressed about this. I'm worried about how the family's doing. I'm not sure that this house is appropriate for us. I'm really concerned about it. That just doesn't happen. Instead, it'll be like, I have a stomach ache. I don't want to get out of the car. I don't want to go to school or anywhere else. So sometimes you see what we call, sorry, this is jargon, but somatic symptoms. Yes. Headaches, stomach aches. And it doesn't mean that those are not real, but it just means that when repetitively, you know, a parent is experiencing or seeing a kid and there's nothing medically that arises where their clinician, their family practice person, nurse practitioner or whatever, looks up, does appropriate kinds of evaluative measures, both, you know,
medically.
Right. And they see nothing. It's like, then you start thinking, well, maybe this is like psychogenic. And it's not anything to be embarrassed by. It's like, again, kids are not going to be able to articulate stuff. So that's just the way that it oftentimes shows up. Okay, great. So then we go after it and try to like turn down the things that would be causing stress for them, that then diminish headaches, stomach aches, everything else. So that's the most common one. ADHD is real common. People recognize that more now. The good news is that it's become less sexist. It used to be that the ratio of boys diagnosed with ADHD compared to girls was much, much higher. And now that's kind of diminished. But as we talk about the diagnosis, I'm absolutely going to say the probably counterintuitive thing. There's nobody that doesn't have some degree of difficulty with anxiety periodically or having sad days or like going, I'm overwhelmed. I forgot X or Y or Z, whether it's my books because I'm a student or whether it's a parent's like, oh my gosh, I was supposed to like help this kid. We all have trouble with attention sometimes. We all have, so it's like, we don't need to pathologize everything. It's normal for kids to have up and down kind of intervals and for us to like go, wait a minute, is it really interfering with their functioning ongoing and in multiple spheres? And there's only a couple of spheres. There's like school. You got to be able to progress in school. You know, doing 3 years in the 3rd grade, probably not helpful for most people. You got to be able to have friends for more than a week. Yes, we know you change them around someone, but we want our kids to like have attachments to other peers and feel parts of things, whether it's clubs or sports or music or whatever. And then you got to be able to go with your parents to eat like out in a restaurant and go to the grocery store successfully. So it's really those 3 spheres. And if multiple of those spheres are compromised, like they're struggling with family and they're struggling with peers, then it's like, wait a minute, you should be talking with your primary care clinician about this to be thinking about, is there something we need to do to like help this kid with the skill development to move forward rather than, well, is it this disorder or that disorder? That's less important than just targeting that kid's unique constellation of symptoms.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, because basically saying not everything is a mental health disorder. There are spectrums, and most times it isn't. Most times it's, but if it's impacting different areas of life, that's when you should definitely reach out. That's a great point.
Because I look at children, you know, and age development, and I always think of social emotional learning. It's like, what skill do they need to learn, right? It's like a yet, because they're still developing. And I always think about that from the other coordinator in our office. Like, what skill do we need to teach them before we send them and take them down that whole rabbit hole and testing? And will that suffice? Will teaching them suffice that at this point, depending on the level?
Absolutely. And the National Center for School Mental Health here in Maryland, right? I mean, they're at the forefront of this, and they've really been good with advocating and making it just familiar that they're at the tiers. You know, there's kind of like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier, like universal. Like there's not someone going around sprinkling fairy dust so that someone suddenly has good social pragmatic skills and knows how to like interact with people and ask people out for a date or whatever when they're 13 or 14, and that's just like automatic. Some people struggle mightily with that, and so there's social skills that are real important for everybody to learn, beginning at the very beginning. There's like executive functioning skills
Yes.
in our increasingly complicated world where there's so much to keep
my
up
gosh.
with, and 100 TV stations coming at you all the time instead of 3 when I was a kid. It's like keeping tabs on all that stuff is really, really hard. So executive functioning skills we're really working hard on now to
Yep.
make sure that those are infused into all the classes in the curriculum. You got to be able to get along with people. There will be conflict. You have to be able to kind of navigate that kind of stuff.
Yep.
And you got to be able to regulate your mood.
Yep.
Again, we all get anxious. That's healthy. There's times when you should be anxious because it keeps you from doing things that could be putting yourself in a dangerous situation.
Right.
Exactly. So learning how to like be able to recognize frightening things and go, wait a minute, is this really scary, my good friend Ryan? Can't trust Susan, or vice versa, or whatever it might be. The point is that there are ways for kids to regulate their mood that
Right.
we want them to learn at early ages.
Exactly.
Excellent.
Exactly.
Good. Well, thank you. And we're going to take a break. So after the break, we will continue our conversation with Dr. Jeff Bostic from the Maryland Mental Health Response Team. Stay tuned. Welcome back to At Your Service. We're here with Dr. Jeff Bostic from the Mental Health Response Team, and we've had some really great conversation about what are some of the mental health challenges that students face. And one question that we had was really, as we talk about kind of in this post-pandemic world, how have kids been recovering since the pandemic, and what does mental health look like? What did it look like during the pandemic, and what does it kind of look like now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, the U.S. Surgeon General, right, just came out with a report about one of the big factors, and I like what he did. He talked about loneliness. Again, instead of pathologizing, we have this percent of
Yes.
depression. It's like everybody struggled. I mean, humans do like familiar things.
Right.
And when you disrupt their routine, and in this case, everybody's routine across planet Earth was disrupted. So parents were struggling like, wait, how do I do my job and also do my child care? Teachers particularly were struggling with that. Kids were like, wait a minute, I don't have the usual kids out. So the pandemic was a really unusual blip. And so we're still rebooting from that.
Right.
And so what we saw is that there was a lot of isolation and or kids would be isolated and then try to like connect, through social media. And social media, I'll use my bad metaphor. It's like any other device that's out there. A chainsaw is neither good nor bad. It's what you do with it,
Right.
And so similarly, social media, we know that once you start spending like more than about 2 hours, then it makes you vulnerable to not engaging with real people and having real relationships in the same way. And you're more prone to have difficulties with that. And so anyway, kids have really struggled with that. Plus, there's the problem with the way that our social media is kind of unfolded is that people oftentimes present all the good stuff going on in their life, and you're like, gosh, my life is like, so it was really rough. They were both with the pandemic kind of shut down, and then they're looking out at people going to fun places, and they're like, I'm home, So it was really kind of a tough time. So the reconnection part here, which was, nobody's fault. People are coming back and regrouping. And that's been true for everybody, both the teachers that are working with them and the kids. And it just takes time to refine those relationships. And of course, oh my holy goodness, they didn't put the prom on hold for 3 years. So the people who were like in high school or in middle school who are their job, is to separate from their parents as they start connecting with their peer group, that was just kind of put on hiatus for a while.
Yep.
And so now they're supposed to come back and be ready to do all that stuff. So that's hard. The kindergartners who hadn't had time playing with like other little kids in preschool, they missed out on that. So it's been really difficult. And so this too will pass.
Right.
And we're moving back with it. And people, I think, are getting more and more into the groove now of that.
agree.
But it's like, for those kids who are really struggling, it's like, great, we still want to reach out to whether it's a pediatrician, but also educators.
Right.
Educators see like tons of kids and they see which ones are really struggling, which ones are not. So they are a really helpful resource when a parent's like, worried about their kid, like, how's my kid doing?
Right.
Mr. Voegtlin or whoever, Dr. Voegtlin, or whoever my teacher might be, because they will say they're outlying or they're doing just fine and kind of in the mix with this very atypical kind of circumstance that everybody's gone through.
Wow.
Thank you.
Definitely. Because Ryan and I both have young children. I mean, they're not, elementary, but not little. Because I remember my grandson was in kindergarten that first year, the COVID. And so he was sitting on that laptop for 6 hours a day. And I was like, this is not working, right? I told my daughter, this is not working. But I do feel like these past 3 years, you are, restarting, but they're different. But kids are different. You can't go back to that point where we were in March of 2019.
Yep.
They're changed, and I see that a little bit changed.
And I think it's been so hard for, honestly, administrators in schools because
Yeah.
it's like, we've got to get their reading scores up and all this stuff. And it's like,
Yes.
it was no one's fault, but the social skill stuff was not, it couldn't be cultivated in the same kind of way during that point for most people. And so some of those things are having to be like dealt with now.
Right.
And at the cost of, okay, how are we going to still make sure that the reading is going forward, the math skills, all that stuff. So it's just been like recognizing that this has been a very atypical blip.
100%. 100%. So if you have a family, a caregiver, a parent that suspects that their child might have some sort of mental health symptoms, something's going on that's not atypical, right? Or who should they reach out to? What do you suggest?
Well, those first two things, like if you've got a primary care clinician that you know and trust, it's pretty typical now
Okay.
that they do screening at various points. It starts with autism. They start doing
Okay.
that, the first 18 to 24 months to
Wow.
make sure that they're looking for that.
And when you say primary, are you talking about a primary care doctor or okay,
Medical
gotcha.
doctor. Okay.
Well, but I like to be inclusive with
Okay,
things.
yeah, that's why I wanted to clarify clinician. What you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a good distinction to make. Yes, medical doctors are one group. There are also people like family practice doctors. There's doctors. There's also nurse practitioners. There's a variety of people that people go to for their health care. But
Right.
that person, whether it's a nurse practitioner or a doctor, they're usually very helpful. And they are used to screening and looking for these kinds of things, specifically mental health stuff, as well as other physical
Right.
kinds of conditions
Right.
that could be important. So they're a very good person. And then I'm telling you, the school folk are really helpful. They know kids well. Again, it's back to that. They spend tons of time with them. They know when they're having a bad day. When the pediatrician or the nurse practitioner sees them, they're not sure if this is like a very unusual day or if this is like one of like many.
Right.
And so that school stuff is really helpful. And one of the things that we of course do all the time is we encourage parents when they're struggling to get a letter from the school. This is not to impose anything on anybody, but we have a simple template that we use where school staff just say, here's what we're seeing in terms of how they're doing at school, good, bad, and if we're doing well with this, struggling with that. And then that can be factored in when the clinician's evaluating them to go on, like, again, back to those domains. Well, what's going on at home? Parents are good with that.
Right.
They may be less familiar or they may be all over what's going on with the peer stuff, but the school stuff, that's oftentimes one of the places where they're not, really able to keep up with that as well as they can the other spheres.
Yeah,
of
that's a great resource, and that can be filled out by the school counselor
Yep.
or a team of people at the school that know the kid,
Yep.
Right.
and they can do that letter, hand it to the parent, and then the parent can bring it to that primary care
Right.
clinician that they have
Yeah.
to just, like you said, help them understand the full picture.
So, Dr. Bostic, what questions do you think families should ask their, whether it's a pediatrician or a PA, whoever, like, if you all have concerns, what kind of questions should they create before the appointment?
Yeah, so I think it's like when they talk to the clinician that they're working with, and again, this can include the school staff too, they can ask them
Right.
the same kind of questions. It's like, how is my kid doing as far as being able to like keep up with like the tasks, for example, school?
Gotcha.
How is my kid doing? How do they seem to be faring in terms of their development socially, their ability
Right.
to interact and connect with people? Because as we know, loneliness, whether you're young or old, is a huge predictor of your happiness in life. And most parents will say, I want my child to be happy. So it's real important that we recognize, are the kids connecting well? So they should ask their clinicians, does my kid seem like appropriate in the way that they're interacting
Right.
with people here? Does my kid seem to be very like labile, very like erratic where they're starting? Because all this gives us clarity for what skills to be focused on, both parenting, particularly,
Right.
and then of course those distill back to school as well. Oftentimes kids do okay in school because there's a routine and there's a structure that
Yep.
they're used to.
Yep.
Not always the same at home, particularly like after the pandemic where it was like new rules, now different rules, and some of them are things the kids like, some maybe not so much.
Right.
So it's like, what do
Right.
I need to focus on? And again, whether it's that executive functioning skill stuff and planning, one of the things that we've also talked about in the past has been like cognitive flexibility. If
Yeah.
you want to look at like what distinguishes people who do well in life and are happy versus kids who struggle, being able to be flexible, to see options, pros and cons to doing this as well as that happens. And there's silly ways that we do this.
Right.
You can on Taco Tuesday nights or whatever you have in your home, like we're going to have different kinds of picante sauce or salsa,
Right.
just so that kids get used to, like, we don't have what I'm used to, but do I like this one? Okay, is it a 3 or a 5 or whatever? So
Right.
that they get used to doing that as a normal part of their life of dealing with things that are not what they always necessarily want.
Right.
So you create that flexibility by configuring the world to be like that at home as well as at school.
That's a good example. I like that.
So one question that we wanted to talk about was that comes up with parents a lot, and even school staff, is medication management. So if a child has a mental health diagnosis, and a parent is considering medication, what are some advice, or what are some thoughts around that? Like what role does medication play when it comes to treating mental health diagnoses?
Yep. So the first thing is that kids are growing and evolving, and they're much more pliable, they're much more fluid, they're much more resilient in many ways, bizarrely, than people who are kind of like fixed and they're used to doing things in a certain kind of way. So the point is, first thing that we usually try to do are, quote, psychosocial, non-medicine kind of interventions. So we try to do cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, if someone is struggling with like lots of different things, but anxiety or depression and things like that, even at young ages. And at young ages, it may not be like, I'm really sad. It may be that they're just irritated all the time, and therefore they can't go anywhere with the family. They can't like sustain relationships with peers, et cetera, et cetera. So those psychosocial things are first. And in this day and age, 2024, what we've come to appreciate is, for the most part, most therapy stuff works best when you do, if you need something beyond therapy, is you do therapy plus medicine.
Yep.
Not, well, we've tried therapy and that didn't work, so now we're going to do medicine. No. The most effective outcomes, or the most positive outcomes, occur when you do therapy and medicine together, and that means two things. First, you need your clinicians talking to each other. So the person that's prescribing, whether it's the pediatrician, nurse practitioner, or a psychiatrist, it's really helpful if they're in some way in communication with the other people who are doing the therapy, whether that's at home or school or both, so that everybody's on the same page and tasting or going after the target symptoms. Because no medicine that we currently have in psychiatry will fix anything. It will diminish the symptoms, but it's not going to cure anything. We just don't have those medicines yet. We're working on it, but we don't have them yet. They can diminish the symptoms, and we consider it successful medication treatment when someone's symptoms improve about 30%.
Wow.
Not 100%.
Right.
So it's still like we got a ways to go. And when we use the medicines and they turn down someone's obsessive kind of behaviors or anxiety stuff or ADHD, you still got to infuse the executive functioning skill stuff so that the kid learns to do that and think through things before being impulsive if they have ADHD, or the anxiety stuff that they know how to, like, wait a minute, I can seek out certain trusted other people when I'm worried, when I'm anxious about stuff, or when I'm sad, I can reach out to these other people. They have to have those skills in place, so you really need those two wedded in most cases.
Yeah, and what about, that's excellent information. What about, like, if a parent, they're hesitant to try medication, then they try some, and their child is having some side effects, or they're not seeing the improvement, or it's not having the effect that they want. What advice do you give to them? Like, should they just give up on it? Should they maybe try because it's not working? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I'm laughing because I wish we were more sophisticated, but we're not in 2024, but we're working on it. So the first thing is that depending on the symptoms that you're trying to fix or improve with the medicine, the medicines that you use, some of them work very quickly. The medicines for ADHD, the stimulant medicines, the Adderalls, the Ritalins, Concertas, all those, you can usually see a difference in about 3 to 7 days with those. Good, bad, or indifferent. Okay? So those are really quick. But most of the other medicines, the ones that you use for anxiety, depression, distorted thinking, those take like 2 to 4 weeks typically. So before someone looks up, we put Hubert on this medicine and now 3 days later, they have more of a cough, so we took him off or whatever. It's like, that's not really a fair test or trial of that if you're trying to do something for anxiety or depression or stuff like that. If you do have a problem, the good news is that there are typically in every class, there's multiple different ones. So there's, even though there's only 2 primary stimulants, for example, there's at least 14 different formulations of it. And so sometimes people will do poorly on one. And so it's like, you identify the side effects, you let your provider know, and then they can typically try a different one. And pretty quickly, like with the stimulants. With stuff like with depression, we tend to taper them off and then start a new one. Give it 2 to 4 weeks, but people will uniquely respond sometimes to one better than the other. And when you're talking about, for example, ADHD, and or you're talking about anxiety or depression, you're not usually on medicine like you are for a sore throat for 2 weeks and then like you can tolerate the diarrhea or whatever,
Right.
then it's okay. You're going to be on them probably for months.
Yeah.
And so for that span of time, you want one that's a good fit. Now, this is real important. People are like, well, wait a minute. Once I put my child on medicine, does that mean they're always going to be on it? The answer is we hope not. And the game plan is to try to, again, infuse the skills while they're on the medicine so that we can then try to move the medicine away. Some people prefer to keep it going as they get older. Oftentimes they don't. And our goal is not to have anybody on anything that we don't have to have them on because we don't want that to interact with some other medicine they might need when they're
Right.
older, or to have all medicines have side effects. So anytime we can like revisit, do we really need this medicine? That's what we do.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, that information is so helpful, and I think it's going to be helpful to our audience. And I think we could sit here and talk to you all
I
day.
know.
So we really appreciate you being with us today. Like we said, the information you're sharing is invaluable. So thank you all for joining us also, and we look forward to seeing you next time on At Your Service.